My job is to watch people die. If you met me on the street and asked me what my job was, I would tell you that I work from home, consulting for an industrial laundry company. That is, after all, the cover story I have been provided with. The reality? My job is even simpler. Every Friday night, I dress up nice, report to a certain theater downtown, have a seat, and watch a performance. That's it. All it takes is a couple of hours out of my week, and I end up making 6 figures a year with every benefit you could possibly ask for. I know. It sounds too good to be true. Pretty much anybody on the planet would kill to have a job like mine, at least. Perhaps until they find out just what kind of performances I'm made to attend. Before I start, though, I need you to keep in mind that I'm a good person. I donate thousands to the Rainforest Fund out of every paycheck, and me and my kids volunteer at the food bank weekly. I'm a devout believer, and I'm going to heaven when I die. After all, I myself have never hurt anybody. Never raised a hand to injure any living soul. How could you possibly call me a sinner, when all I ever do is watch? It started about 3 years ago, when their job offer found me at my most desperate. All I was told was every Friday night, I would attend a performance at my city's fanciest theater. That was it. I was baffled at first. What the hell do I know about theater, or ballet, or orchestras? Had they gotten me mixed up with some big-shot critic? During our talk on the phone, however, they politely reassured me that no critical ability would be required. All we asked, they said, is for you to be there to bear witness. Everything about it screamed scam. But I figured, what the hell? Worst case scenario, I listen to a pitch for some MLM or timeshare, politely decline, and then walk out with some pocket money. I was baffled when I pulled up to the theater. Dozens, maybe even hundreds of people were streaming in, all in nice suits and gorgeous gowns. I'd thrown on the fanciest clothes I could afford, yet I still felt severely underdressed. The theater was totally rented out by my employer, and only my fellow coworkers were allowed in. How much could it have cost to hire such a massive crowd just to attend this one performance? Who could possibly bankroll something like this? I tried to empty my mind and simply merge into that human tidal wave flowing through the doors. Every staff member was dressed in a refined all-black suit, with a black tie and undershirt, to the point they seemed to darken the air around them. Each wore a white comedy mask, the neoprene stretched into a grin of perpetual laughter, which struck me as almost mocking. They demanded that we hand over all electronic devices, even patting us down and running a metal detector over us. Then they reminded all attending not to leave their seats under any circumstances during the performance, recommending we take bathroom breaks before the show started, and to remain quiet and to keep our eyes open. They kept repeating the same mantra. No distractions. No diversions. No lapses in concentration. Remember, you are here to bear witness. If I'd been alone, I would have left right then and there. There was a tickling in the back of my brain, some primate part of me screaming that there was something terribly wrong here. But mob mentality is a hell of a thing. Everybody else seemed calm, nonplussed, handing their phones over without a fuss. There were a few holdouts, probably other newbies like me, but eventually they, too, relented. If everyone else is going along with it, I figured, why shouldn't I? Who wants to be the one, single paranoid bastard who missed out on an easy paycheck? Stepping into a gorgeous theater, like something out of 3 centuries ago, I was most struck by the make of the stage. It looked like the back action of a piano, strange levers and mahogany hammers looking like fingers manipulating countless lines of piano wire, some over a dozen feet long. All the taut wires stretched in bizarre formations across the stage reminded me, somehow, of a spider's web. I could not fathom a machine so complex, yet with such little apparent purpose. The nature of the performance always varies. Sometimes, it's a work of Shakespeare, a ballet, an opera hell, even a puppet show. That day, it was a concert featuring a small chamber orchestra of around 35 students. It looked like young and inexperienced, with a nervous air about them, as if this was their first time performing before such a crowd. Mostly a string section, plus one of each woodwind, and just a couple each on horns and percussion. The conductor was one of the staff members in the comedy masks. I was baffled. Who would put forward this much cash just for a small, green orchestra to play in such a massive, prestigious venue? One of them must be a billionaire's kid, I figured. It was the only explanation. This, I've since realized, is always the best part. The beginning of the performance. When you can, if you try, lose yourself in the display and pretend everything is okay. Pretend that it's all normal. It was best on those lucky days when the performers on stage were completely unaware of just what sort of danger they were in. That always makes it easier for everybody. On that first day, I was as oblivious as they were, and simply enjoyed the music. Maybe some snob of the orchestral arts would hear their amateurish mistakes, but to my untrained ear, they sounded just fine. Pleasant, even. But one question began to worm its way into my head. It's a small nagging at first, which crescendoed into a hammering on the inside of my skull. How much time has passed? At a certain point, I suspected the intermission was long overdue. But there were no windows, and I had to part with my electronic wristwatch at the door, so really getting any sense of time was impossible. I dismissed it as my lousy attention span at first, but eventually, others began taking notice. No one dared speak, but among the fellow newbies, I noticed furrowed brows and sideways glances, confused and concerned. The performers seemed to be getting restless as well, whispering and gesturing to each other, and the conductor, who never ceased those robotic, sweeping motions of his gloved hands. It must have been 2 hours by then, if I had to guess, and they were starting to look exhausted, dehydrated. Some even looked as if they were about to quit playing, continue performing. In a moment, all of the piano wire loudly reverberated and stretched taut with the movements of those mechanical contraptions on stage, as the whole thing bristled and tensed as though it were a living thing. And that voice, cracking like thunder, seemed to emerge from the stage itself with a mechanical roar, like the grinding of metal on metal. That seemed to frighten them into submission for a while. It wasn't until a half hour later that my life changed irreparably. They'd been playing a quiet sonata, so everybody could hear the sudden furor ting, accompanied by a pained yelp. My eyes leapt to one of the violinists. One of her strings had broken, and it happened to snap her right in the eye. I could see the streak of scarlet bifurcate her pupil before the emerging blood replaced the entire eye with a thick redness. She stood, clutching a hand over her eye and blindly grasping with the other, gesturing for medical help. And as she did so, that strange lattice of levers and hammers and pulleys all roared and clacked to life, like a bear trap being sprung. The machine's efficacy was just as sudden, just as brutal. Those clockwork edifices moved like a pair of robotic arms, aiming a wire for her neck, as if trying to garrote her. But they moved at such a speed that the wire seemed to pass through her, like she wasn't even there. For a moment, she seemed fine, unaffected, as if nothing had happened at all. And then, things began to fall off of her. Her head severed at the neck, alongside the hand she'd been holding over her eye, and the very fingertips of her other hand with which she'd been grasping a little too high. All had been cut cleanly, with surgical precision. Time seemed to slow as they all went clattering wetly to the floor, and the girl's body soon followed, as if it took a few moments for gravity to set in. Or, perhaps, for her body to realize she was dead. It happened so fast. It was hard to be properly horrified. It was more like awe, maybe. Everybody stared at the chunks of meat that had once been a promising young woman with hopes and dreams. That spiderweb of wires was still rumbling and shaking all around them, and the mechanical voice roared once more. Continue performing. They were given no further warnings. A few of them jumped from their seats out of sheer instinct, not even thinking. None of them made it more than a step before the wires divided them in twain. The rest just kept playing exactly as they had been, as if their brains froze up at what they'd witnessed and simply ran on autopilot, until their faculties slowly returned to them, and they realized that this instinct had saved their lives. Where once beauty filled the room, now the orchestra had been reduced to a discordant sound like a long, shuddering whine, a mocking parody of music. They gripped their instruments with trembling, sweaty hands, playing just well enough to avoid stoking the ire of those quivering wires stretched taut all around them. They realized, gradually, that they were allowed to speak. Immediately, they began wailing hard enough to almost mercifully drown out that dismal cacophony that was once music, some begging and pleading with the staff, others screaming out threats, be they legal or physical. Nothing they said could shake the masked men and women in the slightest. They stood at order like statues, unflinching. Realizing this, they turned their attention to us. A wall of red, weepy eyes scanned the crowd for any hint of mercy, begging us to band together against the staff, calling us all sick bastards for just sitting there and watching them die. A blonde woman on violin had the most genius and cruel strategy of all. She merely began telling us about herself. Everything she could think of poured out between sniffles and tears. My name is Vera Hayes. That's my husband over there. She gestured to a dark-haired man on drums. He'd been the quietest of them all, seeming to be saving his strength. We have a little girl. She's 8 years old, and she loves her mama and papa. Her name is Lucy. She loves horses, and I was saving us to maybe give her riding lessons one day. I desperately wanted to cover my ears, but knew it would be against the rules. Why can't she just shut the hell up? I thought bitterly, grinding my teeth. I truly hated her. Hated her more than I'd ever hated before. But why? Some dim remnant of my reason asked. She's a victim here. She's done you no wrong. But I realized I hated her because she kept reminding me she was human. Reminded me of what I was doing to her. What we all were doing to her, sitting here in complicity. And it almost worked, too. I almost resolved to save her. But then came the boom of a gunshot from far behind me. The shot had come from one of the tragedians standing amid the upper gallery, I was certain. I almost made the mistake of looking back. Instead, I kept my eyes locked forward and merely imagined who it was that just had their brains splattered across their seat. Had they snuck a phone in and tried calling 911? Had they tried making a break for it? Or maybe they just couldn't take it anymore and made the fatal decision to look away from the horror. I tried to distract myself by studying the impossible mechanism animating the blood-soaked piano wire. I couldn't figure it out. It was an impossible machine, existing in defiance of all basic laws of geometry, and seemed to have no means of control, instead operating automatically with some malign intelligence. Perhaps it was an extension of whatever creature composed the stage itself. It was a living thing. Of that much I was certain. It breathed beneath the performers, and their blood soaked into its floorboards in moments, as if consumed. After some hours, the orchestra had gone quiet, having screamed themselves hoarse. I couldn't imagine being in their shoes. Even just watching them perform was a test of endurance. Many of them were oozing blood all over their instruments, from scarlet cuts where the skin had split. The woman on the French horn was struggling hardest of all, her lungs and hands burning with exhaustion. "I can't," she eventually cried out in a hoarse little wheeze, her horn slamming to the floor as her body gave out. "I'm so sorry. I can't do any." A wire passed through flesh in an instant, and suddenly she had no mouth to speak, no eyes to see, no mind to think with. All of it lay splattered upon the stage, which sated itself upon that spilled VT. Another gunshot. I quivered in my seat, sweat beading on my forehead from the terror. Somebody in the audience had looked away, and I realized I had just been about to do the same thing, had the sudden sound not knocked me out of my stupor. Most of the performers went in similar ways over the next few hours, either making mistakes or their bodies giving out. As monstrous as it may sound, I was quietly praying for them to get it over with. They were dead the moment that they walked on stage. Why drag it out for all these hours, just for the inevitable to happen anyway? I recognize now that it's almost impossible to make that choice to simply give in and accept death in defiance of all our natural instincts. But the auditorium now reeked from audience members voiding their bowels, and the damn woman next to me just wouldn't stop crying. Wouldn't stop at all. Vera and her husband lasted the longest of all, perhaps because they had each other. Over a dozen hours had passed, maybe even 2, and they were still playing a little duet in perfect sync, despite everything. By now, they were simply talking to each other as if nothing was wrong, as if we weren't even watching. "Baby, when we get out of here, I'm going to take you to Martha's Vineyard. I know I've been saying that for so long, but God, I wasted so much money on that stupid fucking motorcycle," he said. "Lucy's going to love it." Vera chuckled softly. "I don't know. It might be boring for a little girl. Isn't it all a bunch of old people up there?" He laughed weakly. "Oh, maybe in town. But you know her. Once you get her in the water, you can't get her back out. She's a natural-born swimmer, I swear. Think we'll see her in the Olympics someday? Ha ha." It was surreal to watch, like I was peeking in on a private conversation a couple was having in their own home. but I could tell both of them were trying to maintain some illusion of normalcy, anything to keep themselves psychologically intact as the hours passed. Even as they tried to smile and laugh, there was a quiver in their tone, a desperation, a fear of what might happen if there was a single break in the conversation. A lot of what they said was too personal to relay here. They went into old regrets, past mistakes, resolved every argument they ever had in all their years together. It was like they wanted to make sure they said everything they had to say before the end came. I think I owe them, at least their privacy. But the husband was slowly deteriorating. He'd moved too quickly, caught the cymbal with his hand, leaving a wide gash along his palm that was gushing blood at a terrifying rate. Now he was getting woozier and woozier, swaying dizzily, his eyes unfocusing, his speech becoming slurred, and his playing sloppy. Vera desperately tried to keep him focused. Talk to me, baby. Think of the beach. Lucy's going to love the seashells. She'll pick her favorite and put it on that little stand in her room with all her little trophies. She rambled on and on. But by the end, all he could manage was half-hearted grunts of affirmation. He was leaning in his seat, and then his drumstick went flying right out of his hand, sending a cloud of pink mist through the air along its path. And yet he kept going through the motions of playing, as if he didn't even notice. Then a sudden clarity formed in his eyes, and he stared at his empty hand in disbelief. And then the piano wire was tensing and strumming all around him, and in an instant he was up from his seat and racing towards us. He knew it was over. He just wanted to strike out at the world if he could one last act of defiance. He even locked eyes with me, and I'll never forget the look on his face. Why are you watching this? You sick bastards. You sick, twisted. He threw his remaining drumstick, and the trajectory would have delivered it right to me. But the piano wires lacerated it in mid-air, slicing into it from 100 different directions until it disappeared into a cloud of sawdust. And then, they did the same to him. Vera didn't scream or sob. She just tensed and let out the tiniest little gasp, like when you're at the doctor's office and know the shot is inevitable, but it still stings anyway. And then, she was all alone. She looked at us like she wanted to speak, wanted to say something, to express what was happening inside her, but what was there left to say? She'd spent almost a full day screaming herself hoarse with every combination of words she could think of. None of it helped. None of it meant anything. Instead, she expressed herself through music. She began to play the most mournful, sobering solo I had ever heard. It was a piece I knew she was making up as she went along, one with which she communicated those parts of herself that words could not encompass. She stared us all down, her eyes red and bloodshot, making eye contact individually, as if to remind us that we were not a shapeless mass, that we were all individually responsible. I only barely remember the sound of it now, as if I'd heard it in a dream, and yet, even now, the memory tears at my heart. She performed for what felt like an eternity. And then, in the end, she slowly, calmly set down her violin, stood up, and took a bow. And then, she was unmade. Everyone stood up around me all of a sudden, and I was immediately caught up in it too, performing a standing ovation that dragged on and on. We screamed, shouted, cried, threw things, smashed our fists against seats, tore at our hair, laughed, and danced with each other. It was the ultimate catharsis after all that silence, after a full day of holding it all in. Never before had I felt so connected to a crowd of people on some deep, spiritual level. We marched out of the theater, stumbling like a procession of ghouls with blank faces and tired eyes. The staff were as polite as ever, thanking us for attending the performance and hoping that we enjoyed the show. Some were dragging the bodies of shot audience members out of the theater. As I finally emerged into the outside world, I was stunned to find it was still the same night I had entered. At least 20 hours had passed inside that theater, I was sure of it, but for the outside world, only 2 hours had passed exactly the duration listed on their job offer. I'd never been explicitly told not to reveal what I'd seen there, and now I knew why. Nobody believed me, or worse, maybe they were covering it up. I swear to God, the police dispatcher laughed at me over the phone. I swore I'd never go back. I'd been part of something evil, something unfathomable, and it would haunt me forever. But the next year was one of constant desperation, debt climbing as job opportunities declined at equal rates. I held out for about a year, but eventually I gave in. And to my horror, the next performance was easier now that I knew what to expect. And then the next was easier still. And the next. The performance is always different, but the end result is always the same. I have to remind myself that I'm not culpable for what they're doing there. All I do is watch. We watch people die every day in the news. Online people suffering horrible fates, often in places our own countries help to destabilize. How are my actions any different, really? We all have to accept that terrible things happen in this world, and all we can do about them is either look away, or look the horror right in the eye. Is choosing to look away more moral, or is it only more cowardly? And besides, wouldn't it be worse for them if there wasn't an audience? If they had to die there in the dark, alone, no one seeing, no one caring, no one remembering. After all, someone has to bear witness. Every year on my birthday, I have to die. I died for the first time on the 18th of August, 2006. It wasn't a particularly pleasant death, nor was it one that I expected. It was simply the random act of violence that destroyed my life. And it came out of nowhere. We were just relaxing at the pub, enjoying a few drinks after a busy day at work. It was my turn to buy a round of drinks, so I was trying to get the attention of the bartender. I felt someone punch me in the side. At first I thought someone had just hit me, but then I felt the warmth and the rapid stream of blood pouring down my shirt. I realized then and there that I'd actually gotten stabbed. As far as I can remember, it wasn't even that painful. Still, my legs gave out under me, and I collapsed to the floor. Even then, I worried more about ruining my expensive suit, ignoring the fact that I might be dying. Oncoming death is funny like that. Everyone thinks they're the exception, that they'll get out from whatever horrible situation the universe has thrust upon them. At least that's what I thought, as the life drained from my body. The world around me just faded to black, and before I knew it, I had just died. Then there was the void. At first, it was little more than darkness, only broken by weird shapes and colors in the distance. As I regained a sense of surroundings, I was dragged towards a new world, one without pain, suffering, nor death. All there was were people on a journey to different destinations. Whether they had all died like myself, or if they weren't born yet, I didn't know. All I knew was that I wasn't afraid anymore. The worries, the anxiety, and all my fears had been left behind. A light appeared in the distance, endlessly far away. I knew that would be my final destination, my final purpose in the brief life I'd led. Unfortunately, I never managed to get that far. I was jolted awake in my own bed, soaking wet from sweat and shaking like a maniac. My hand reflectively clutched my side to cover up the wound I'd sustained. But it wasn't there anymore. In fact, I didn't have a single scratch on me. Had it all been a dream? My phone lit up on the bedside table. I picked it up to find dozens of text messages and missed calls. "Hey man, we're at the pub. You coming or what?" The first message read, sent at 9:43 p.m. "Hey Rick, where the hell are you?" The second message read, sent at 10:23 p.m. Then there were a couple of phone calls and another message. "I guess you fell asleep, or maybe you're getting lucky. Whatever. I'll drink another shot in your honor. Happy birthday, Rick." Then I had over 20 phone calls and a singular message that sent shivers down my spine. "For fuck's sake, pick up the damn phone. Something happened to Danny." I immediately called back. My fingers were trembling both from anticipation and from the memory of what had happened only a night ago. Even if my death had been little more than a nightmare, I knew for sure that I'd met up with my friends at the pub. The phone rang 3 times. Then Jake picked up. "Rick, is that you?" "Where the hell are you?" Jake asked with a panicked, tired voice. I don't know what happened. I guess I fell asleep," I half-asked, half-stated. "Danny got stabbed last night," Jake said without listening to my explanation. "Stabbed? How?" "I don't know. Some nut job just walked up to him and stabbed him in the side. I almost dropped my phone in shock. Danny had been attacked just like myself, in exactly the same place. 1,000 thoughts rushed through my mind, but worry quickly became my main concern. Is he all right? He's still in surgery. They're only letting his wife know about wait, here she comes. Jake put his phone down, but I could still hear the muffled sound of their discussion. Danny's wife seemed upset, but I couldn't make out the words. Jake, I asked. He's dead. Danny's dead. The next few moments turned into a blurry haze of information. We'd all known Danny since we were kids, and now he was just gone. The murderer never even made it out from the pub. Apparently he got shot by one of the patrons as he tried to attack another guest. Still, I just couldn't shake the feeling that I was supposed to die that night. Regardless of what happened, time marched on without answers. Some of our coworkers quit after Danny's death, trying to hopelessly move on. I didn't blame them, I also needed some distance. I never even told them what I experienced that night, it wouldn't have helped them anyway. A year passed, and I hardly spoke to any of my friends. I started to get some semblance of normalcy in the wake of Danny's death, but that would all come to an end on the 18th of August, 2007. My birthday had arrived yet again, and I had absolutely no intention of celebrating it. Instead, I called in sick to work, bought a bottle of whiskey, and spent the day playing video games. By the time day had given way to night, I'd almost finished the bottle. Even as a rather large guy, the alcohol had hit me hard. At around 9 o'clock, I just passed out in bed, awaiting a horrible hangover in the morning. I only awoke around midnight, when I heard the front door forcefully break open, followed by footsteps and whispers. I tried to get up, still drowsy from the alcohol. As I took one step out from my bed, I slipped and came tumbling down onto the floor. It produced a massive crash, loud enough to alert whichever intruders had broken in. I thought you said no one would be home, a man stated angrily. Don't worry about it. I'll go deal with them. The footsteps moved quickly in my direction. I tried to lock the door, but they were too fast, kicking it open and knocking me back to the ground. A masked man entered my room, holding onto a gun. He only spoke a single sentence to me, before pointing the weapon at me and pulling the trigger. You should have stayed quiet. Unfortunately, the man was a horrible shot. He'd aimed at my head, but it hit me in my throat instead. There I lay, drowning in my own blood as I desperately gasped for air. I couldn't crawl away, and I couldn't call for help. I died on my bedroom floor, on my own birthday, just as I had a year earlier. Once the life finally drained from my body, and the god-awful pain ceased, I was back in the world beyond. I walked through the same, colorful dimension that lay just on the edge of life. I admired the shapes and colors as they passed. In the distance, I saw a tree with branches stretching endlessly far from its trunk. From each branch dangled a person, real but not existing in our world. I wanted to visit them, but that wasn't my destination. Because just like before, I would awake in my own bed, unharmed by the events from the previous night. My phone buzzed, and I was filled with unfathomable dread. I still couldn't quite believe it, but I started to understand that someone would take my place in death. Hello. Rick, it's Dad. Your mother. She passed away last night. A lump formed in my throat. I knew what was coming next, but I had to ask. How? What happened? The police say it was a burglary gone wrong. I don't know, I was working late. I should have been there. The discussion trailed off from there. My dad was distraught and could barely form coherent sentences. He blamed himself for not being there, but I knew the truth. It was my fault. During the next 2 months, he fell into deep depression. I couldn't blame him. He'd just lost the love of his life. I moved in with him, just to help him pick up the pieces. He put on a strong face, trying his best to keep the ship afloat, but I could tell how close he was to just breaking down. If only I'd been there. It wasn't your fault, Dad. Had you been there, you might be gone too? You don't know that. But I did know, because the burglars weren't ever supposed to visit my parents' house. They were supposed to kill me. I had to come clean. I had to let them know the truth. But how could I? Half a year passed, and the secret ate at me. After everything that had happened, I still didn't know how to explain it. Still, I decided it was time to share my curse. Dad, can we talk? Yeah, what's going on? He asked with a worried expression on his face. He knew me well, and he could tell a heavy burden was weighing me down. I started by telling him about my first death, down to the smallest detail. Of course, it matched everything that people had witnessed in the pub that night, even the location of the stab wound. I told him Danny had taken my place in death, and that I felt guilty. Naturally, he was skeptical at first. But then I told him about my mother. I didn't spare him any details. I told him where I'd gotten shot, that the door had been broken down, and that there were 2 robbers. Every detail matched perfectly down to the letter. I'm so sorry, Dad. It was my fault. I killed her. He just sat there in silence, processing what I'd just told him. It wasn't your fault. I was confused. There wasn't a single ounce of anger in his words, only overwhelming empathy. How can you say that? She didn't have to die. He mulled over his next words carefully before speaking. You didn't do anything wrong, Rick. You just went about your life, and these things happened to you. I don't know why you've been brought back, or even how, but you're not to blame for what is done to you. So you believe me? I asked. He nodded and embraced me in a hug. Suddenly, I wasn't alone in the world anymore. Someone knew what was happening to me. What if it happens again? Then we'll get through it together. He stood by these words, even as my next birthday rolled around. That death was more tame. I just slipped in the shower and broke my neck. The last thought that went through my mind as I left the world for a 3rd time was how fucking cliché. Once again, I awoke in my bed. I called out for my dad, making sure he was still alive, horrified that he might have taken my place. I couldn't even breathe until he came rushing to my side, asking what had happened. I broke my neck. But I'm fine, I think. It took a while before I figured out who had taken my place that time. But once I heard that my boss had died, something broke inside me. He was the kindest man I'd ever met, and just like myself, he'd slipped and broken his neck. That was the final straw. It wasn't some bizarre coincidence I could brush off, nor a premonition. I decided, then and there, that I couldn't live with the responsibility. I had to put a stop to it, even if it meant giving up my own life. I figured that if I took control over my own fate and killed myself outside of my own birthday, maybe I could prevent more people from dying. First, I left behind a long letter to my father, explaining why I'd chosen to leave. I couldn't face him in person. I knew he'd just try to talk me out of it, but it was something I had to do. I couldn't allow any more people to die on my behalf. Alas, fate is a fickle bitch. No matter how hard I tried, I just couldn't end my own life. I tried hanging, but the rope broke. Then, I tried to shoot myself, but the gun jammed. When that failed, I tried to drive my car into a tree, but I somehow survived that as well. Every attempt was met with failure. All I could do was wait for my next birthday and let someone die in my place. No matter how many times I tried, I couldn't die. I was a slave to destiny, and it was destroying me. In 2009, I was hit by a drunk driver, and my girlfriend took my place. In 2010, I drowned, and my kind neighbor had to go through that death. In 2011, I died from a brain aneurysm, which ended up killing my aunt, and so on, and so on. Each year, I'd die, and a person close to me would take my place. I kept trying to find a way out, but fate wouldn't have it. Years went by, and on the 18th of August 2019, I would die for the 14th time. I'd already fallen sick a week earlier, much to the doctor's confusion. According to each and every laboratory value, I was fine, yet I kept getting sicker. My father and I both knew my time was near, but we also knew I'd be forcefully brought back. Then, at midnight on my birthday, my heart just gave out. I was jolted awake in my own bed, and the sickness was little more than a distant memory. Dad, I called out. No response. I got out of bed and called his name again. I was met with silence. I didn't have to call out a 3rd time. I already knew what had happened. I carefully walked into his room, horrified at what I knew would come. He was dead, just gone from a heart attack. He'd taken my place, and I could do nothing to save him. The funeral came and went in a blur. The only noticeable thing was the missing seats from the people who had passed before him. Some of them had lived their own lives and died as nature intended, but a number of them were supposed to live on. Instead, they'd just taken my place in death. I inherited a number of things from my father. Among them, I found a letter addressed to me. It looked rather worn, so I could tell he'd written it a long time ago. Dear Richard, today is your birthday, and it has officially been a year since your mother passed. While I miss her greatly, I'm thankful to still have you around. I know that if she was given the choice, she would want you to live. I feel the same way. We both know that I might one day take your place in death. Never doubt that I would happily give my life if it means that you may live. You didn't choose this curse, so never blame yourself. Just do what every person is supposed to: appreciate the people around you, because you never know which day might be their last. I love you. Dad. Since I read that letter, I've been looking for a way out. My father might want me to stay behind, but how can I live on, knowing that I'm taking someone's place? I've long since left town, living by myself in a cabin somewhere away from people. Hopefully, if I have no one left that cares for me, people will stop dying. At least until I can figure out not only how to die, but how to actually stay dead. I'm sorry. All my exes die after we break up. My first girlfriend, Crystal, died at 16, right after I broke up with her. For a long time, I thought it was just a coincidence. I felt differently when my next girlfriend, Nicole, died right after we broke up a few years later. They both died in odd circumstances. Crystal crashed her car, flat sober, on a straight road by herself. Nicole drowned in the bathtub after falling asleep. Both were labeled as accidents. I was never questioned by police, but plenty of people around town talked, wondered if I was cursed. I wondered the same. Then I moved away. The military took me all the way across the country, and I was happy. I fell in love with a girl named Katie. Everything was good, until I went to a cousin's wedding out of town by myself. The drinks flowed. Too many. I lost control. I got in deep with a girl there I thought was too hot to not keep talking to and keep drinking with. We ended up back at my hotel room. I was too drunk to stop. We had sex, and she stayed the night with me. I woke up with an instant sinking feeling of regret. I also woke up alone, but the girl whose name I couldn't even remember was in the bathroom. She was crying. I listened to her weep uncontrollably for a few moments, unsure of what to do. Then I heard glass breaking, and I rushed into the bathroom. The girl from the night before was in there with a shard of broken mirror in her grasp. I begged her not to hurt herself. She screamed back at me that she loved her boyfriend, and she couldn't believe what she had done. She wanted to die. Then she inexplicably started saying a name I hadn't heard in years. Holive. Hearing that name reached into the darkest recesses of my brain. Holive was a dirt poor girl in my 5th grade class. Homely. She was teased and someone who received no interest as someone anyone wanted to date. Instead, she was mocked. We went too far. Someone dared me to ask out Holive and pretend to be her boyfriend for a week. I agreed to do it, trying to impress my peers. Holive seemed to have no idea the thing was a farce. She held my hand on the schoolyard and didn't seem to see the other kids snickering all the while. The worst part is, I could feel she was sweet and genuine during our time together. She was a nice person. I had to get out of it. I had my friend break up with her a few days into the spoof relationship. Holive was crushed. I felt horrible. She never made eye contact with me again. One day after recess, I came back to my desk and found a piece of paper with burnt ends and found an endless abyss of vulgar and dark words scrawled all over it in black ink and pentagrams. I tried to decipher what it specifically all meant, but couldn't. It just said awful things. Embarrassed and guilty, I never told anyone about it or confronted Holive about it. Holive moved away at the end of that school year. One of the girls in the class said she lived near her and thought her parents were deep into the occult, witches, spells, all that kind of stuff. I figured it was bullshit. It wasn't until I heard the woman in the bathroom screaming out her name that all those scrawled words of hate and love and darkness on that burnt paper Holly left on my desk came back into my head. That dark little girl must have cursed me and any lover that left me. Holly, the words spat out of my one-night stand in the bathroom and snatched me out of my memory dive. Then the woman took that shard of glass and ferociously sliced both of her wrists before I could even try to do anything. The girl from the wedding ended up living, and she explained to everyone that she did what she did to herself and wanted to cover up for me being there to protect her own relationship. So I got lucky, and no one ever found out. I know what you're thinking now though, but don't. The girl later died after her wounds became infected from the gashes. The curse was still alive. I had an easy solution to it all. I was going to marry Katie and stay with her forever. I proposed. She was a bit thrown off by the haste, but she said yes. Everything was going well. We kept going through the motions of love and prep, slowly planning our wedding. I wasn't in any particular hurry. Then I came home one day, and her wedding ring was resting on the kitchen counter with a note that she was leaving me. No particular reason given. She said in the note she had to stay away from me for a week so she could be clear of mind. There was no way I could make that happen. I knew I was racing a clock. I was waiting to hear that she had died every second as I drove around, going to every place that she could be. I found her at her sister's house, and after hours of pleading and explaining that her safety was in serious question, she finally came out and talked to me in the yard. I explained everything. I watched her face convey that she now regretted every single second of our relationship. Then she walked inside. Weeks went by without much sleep. I kept just thinking I was soon going to be invited to her funeral, and I wondered if it would be in some circumstance where people thought I might have done it to her. She showed up in the middle of the night one night with a knock on my door. I let her in, so happy to see her alive and breathing. She explained she had nearly died in 3 separate freak accidents since she left me. She believed in the curse. She could feel it inside her. She had suicidal thoughts she had never even imagined before. We had to be together. The wedding was back on. Now you're probably wondering, why did that dark little girl I messed with back in 5th grade do something that ultimately won me back the love of my life? Wasn't she now going to kill Katie or something? The thing was, my time away from Katie made me realize that I didn't love her. I didn't really miss her and enjoyed my time alone. I thought about my previous, dearly departed partners and realized I loved them more than her. I dreamed of a relationship that would truly bring it all together for me. I was cursed with a fake love forever, or I had to be okay with Katie dying. So the fake relationship I pranked that poor girl with in 5th grade meant I was going to be stuck in a fake relationship for the rest of my life. Well played, Holly. I interviewed a man who cannot die. About a week ago, I grabbed my camera, a small lapel mic, and a spare battery as I left my house. It had always been a bit of a dream of mine to speak to strangers and learn their life stories. I found something so intriguing about the hidden stories within the crowds around me. I wanted to record those stories and share them on the internet. The curiosity clawed at me, begging to be let out. On a Sunday I had off, I set out to fulfill said dream with what little equipment I had. I took the train into my local city. The ride was about an hour long. The train rattled along the tracks as I was basked in the blue-green tinted light from the windows. I hugged my equipment with a hopeful naivety. When the train pulled into the station, I was the first off. I was practically running out of the station and into the streets. I stepped out full of hope and excitement. The day was warm and bright. Well, as I tried to find candidates, I found that people weren't too fond of laying their life out in front of me, especially not in front of a camera. Most people said they were busy, some said they just weren't comfortable with it. I wonder what would have happened if I just gave up. If I just turned down a corner a little farther away, I never would have met him. He was sitting in front of a closed storefront without a sign, cup or hat to collect money from those who pitied him. He just sat and watched the people pass. He was haggard and wore little more than rags layered over rags. Beneath the layers of tattered coats, his skin was cracked and wrinkled. Dirt worked its way into every fold in his leathery skin. His ethnicity was wholly untraceable and ambiguous. You could stare at him for an hour, come to a conclusion on his background, and then have the decision shaken when you turned your gaze back upon him. His hair was long, black, and thick with grease. There was some unidentifiable factor about him that drew me in. He seemed to be marked with an air of intrigue, and, as I would find out, long carried misery. When I approached him, he kept his head to the pavement. Despite the lack of proof to back it up, I was struck with the feeling that he was watching me, if not with his eyes, then by some other sense of his. "Excuse me, sir," I said to him with poorly covered anxiety. "Would you mind being interviewed on camera? I'd like to know your story. It could be any story of yours. I'm very interested in learning about your life, and maybe even sharing it with others." He raised his head, and I was pierced by his gaze for the first time. His eyes were hard to describe. They were the deepest and most experienced eyes I had ever seen. If the eyes are a window into the soul, a glance through these windows reveals generations of clutter. I was taken off guard when he spoke. His voice was hoarse and sounded as if it hadn't been used in a very long time. His accent was about as impossible to identify as his ethnic background. His words were imprinted with a bias towards a language that had either been lost or had died. He told me that he was willing to be interviewed in exchange for a meal. I bought him food from the nearest fast food joint and ran back to his corner. When he lifted his head to watch my return, those eyes contained no expectancy and no emotion. He just watched as I presented him with what I'd bought for him. He ate silently with his bare hands as I set up my equipment. He ate slowly and carefully. I clipped the microphone to one of his tattered coats and started the interview. "Good morning, how are you today?" I started off. Despite my preparation, I was pretty unprepared to actually conduct the interview. "Good morning," was all he said in return. "What's your name? And how old are you?" I forgot my name a long time ago, and you wouldn't believe me if I told you my age. I was taken aback, letting out a bit of an anxious laugh. "Okay, well, where are you from? Did you grow up in the city, out of state, or in another country?" I don't think I've heard a laugh like his before. He choked on every breath. I don't keep track of what it's called nowadays. It's changed a lot over my life. If I'm being honest, I was starting to get kind of annoyed with him. He just wasn't giving me any real answers. "Well, would you like to tell me your story, how you got here, and what led up to that?" He paused for a moment, coughed, and spoke. My clearest and oldest memory is probably my most substantial one. It was a long time ago, but I killed my brother. He had been getting on my nerves for a long time, so I struck him over the head with a stone while we worked. His cries were so terrible. He had never felt such pain before. I think he noticed my disposition change once he said this. "Don't worry," he said in an attempt to soothe me. "I have been duly punished 1,000-fold." Since that day, he continued, I have been marked. Not a physical mark, he cackled as he saw my eyes search him. I'm marked by misery. The very fabric of the world around me drags me in such a way that I cannot die. But I cannot exactly live. I wander. I am manifestly incapable of working. Nobody accepts me to work, and I can never seem to grip any kind of tool without it slipping out of my hands. I used to be a great farm hand when I still had my brother, you know. I haven't touched soil since. You wander. I've never been to the same place twice. I walk to some town or city and I beg until somebody speaks to me. Once that seal is broken, I leave and I don't come back. I'll leave once we're done with this interview. Where have you been? Everywhere. Everywhere. I've had a lot of time to roam the earth. He shook his coats, and layers of dust leapt up and floated down onto the pavement. So much time. How long? Don't say I won't believe you. I haven't counted. Time doesn't mean much to me anymore. There is today and there is tomorrow. Seasons pass and locations change. I lost track a long time ago. I just can't seem to die. Just as I can't work the land, I can't work a weapon. Whoever I meet, wherever I go, fate's tapestry corrects itself so that I never die. I am fed when I must be fed. I drink when I must drink. And I have never caught any kind of sickness. I kept pressing him about his age, but he just told me to drop it. Beyond the unbelievability of it, the information seemed too personal and too delicate to give away to a stranger like me. I moved on, asking him, well, with so much traveling, do you have any interesting anecdotes? Well, he began. Once a man tried to rob me. It was the first time this had happened to me. It was fairly early in my penance for my brother. I genuinely had nothing to my name save my clothes. The same is true throughout my life. He was irate and started swinging a knife at me. I guess this is the first time that I really understood the nature of my punishment. Every slash missed me. The assault ended when a slash missed, and the blade sunk into his own side. I don't know what happened after that. That's been pretty consistent. Whenever I'm in serious mortal danger, some brush of disgusting luck leaves me intact. Every gun leveled against me has jammed. Every assailant's attacks have landed only on themselves. The strings of fate tug at them to prevent my death. Would you say you're divinely protected? He shuddered a bit when I asked him that. Absolutely not. I am cursed. Cursed to wander. Cursed to observe from afar. Cursed to live. Cursed to be unable to form any kind of lasting personal bond. Do you have any idea what that does to a man? I can't say I do. I have had a single friend in my life. It was some dog I fed in some town I've since forgotten. He followed me as I wandered. He was a sickly thing, but I really was quite fond of him. He was killed in the streets by some evil kids who wanted to watch me cry. I'm cursed to bring harm to those around me. I've watched the world around me rise, fall, change, live, die, and breathe as I stood distinctly separate and alone. Quite some time into my sentence, I just found a comfortable place in the wilderness and laid there. I couldn't tell you how long I just laid there. I watched the clouds and the stars and I thought about it all. I've never regretted something more than I regret killing my brother. He got off lucky. If you ask me, punishment was so new back then. My life feels like a trial run for hell. Eternal life and eternal death aren't so dissimilar. I had no idea how to respond to this guy. This was so far from what I wanted to get out of the interview. I thought I could find someone with fun anecdotes from their early days, a tragic twist in their life, and a heartwarming message to keep trying your best. This just sucked, plain and simple. I resolved to just ask one more question and leave. Do you have anything you want to tell whoever may be watching and listening to your story? He thought for some time. Appreciate death while you still have it. I thanked him for his time, packed away my equipment, and walked away. He turned his weathered eyes back to the pavement as I walked away. I couldn't really put my emotions together. Every thought of mine just seemed to sprint off in an odd direction. The train ride back home was spent in the absence of thought. I scrapped the video when I got home. I just couldn't bring myself to revisit the footage. The only reason I'm writing about it here is so I can just get it off my chest. Appreciate death while you still have it. I died and came back. 2 days ago, I overdosed. From what I was told later, my supposed friends pulled up in front of the hospital, threw me out of the car onto the pavement, and took off. I was pronounced dead for almost a minute. I need to share what I saw with anyone willing to listen. So here goes my best possible explanation of something I can hardly explain to myself. I woke up in a void of total blackness, darker than any moonless night I had ever experienced. I tried to scream for help, but no sound came out. I continued at the top of my lungs, nothing. There was literally nothing. No sense of time, space, or sound. I have no idea how long I wandered through that void with no destination, or even the slightest hope I might find one. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it. I saw a bright light at the end of a tunnel, just like I had heard described before. I ran towards that light faster than I thought possible. Then suddenly, the sensation of ground was just gone. The tunnel no longer appeared in front of me, but above. I was floating towards the light. I could feel the warmth and peace emanating through the darkness. The closer I got to the top, the more narrow the tunnel seemed to be getting. I was so focused on that brilliant light, I hadn't even stopped to look around me, until something grabbed me by the ankle. A hand reaching out from inside the wall of the tunnel. Then another, and another. Hands from all sides below me, above me, surrounding me, trying to push or pull me down. No, I screamed. This time my voice made a sound. Please God, help me. Make them stop. Please stop. I pleaded with the hands as they continued to reach out for me. That's when I finally looked down. I saw the hands were attached to the naked bodies of gray, emaciated, desperate faces. They began screeching and wailing. Let me go, please, I begged. I could see now that the tunnel looked like a cave. Carved into the cave were deep grooves circling the entire place. Each groove contained thousands of cages trapping the desperate, decrepit things that were once human, reaching out to push and pull me down. I kicked and flailed and screamed. But there were too many of them. I was so close to the light, so close to what I knew was salvation, but I couldn't reach it as the massive hands continued to grab onto me. I grabbed the sides of the wall, kicking and biting at the hands as I pushed myself upwards as hard as I could. Almost to the top now, I heard a young girl crying. Despite all the hands reaching out, trying to drag me down with them, this girl sat in her cage with her back to me. I realized I would never make it to the top. There were too many desperate, hopeless, pleading hands. But maybe I could save her. Maybe while the hands were distracted with me, I could push her towards the light. I clung to her cage to steady myself. I felt like the hands would tear me limb from limb. I could feel my skin, muscles, and tendons stretching beyond their limits. Crying out in pain, I opened the girl's cage and begged her to take my hand. She turned and looked at me with desperate eyes and grabbed onto me. With all the strength left within my spirit, I shoved the girl as hard as I could towards the light. I watched her cling to the edge, kicking desperately at the hands that tried to pull her back down, until she disappeared over the edge. I laughed joyously. The pain in my limbs was immediately forgotten as I saw that girl disappear into the light, but only for a brief moment as I realized I would very soon find myself in one of these very same cages, like a feral animal damned to be trapped in this place. As I felt myself being pushed and pulled down, I suddenly saw the girl. I saw her little face peering into the hole. She reached out to me, telling me to take her hand. Her hand reached further than what should have been possible. She pulled me free from the awful hands with more strength than what also should have been possible. Nothing made sense in this place. The light was so bright I couldn't see anything at first. As my eyes adjusted, I found myself in the most beautiful field of flowers. Flowing water, trees, mountains more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. The plants seemed to dance to the musical sound of the wind. "Thank you," the young girl said to me. Her eyes showed a deep gratitude. I watched the color come back to her face. She smiled brightly at me. Then I noticed the scars on her wrists. She had killed herself, and in doing so, had damned herself to that awful place. That's when it hit me. The sudden realization of what that place really was. It wasn't hell, not in the biblical sense. It was the place those poor souls damned themselves to be trapped in. Those who hated themselves so much, they ended up right where they believed they belonged. Completely unaware that no devil or creature doomed them to this place, they trapped themselves in death the way they trapped themselves in life. They kept desperately pulling people down with them, when all they had to do was push the person up instead. If every hand that reached out helped to propel that person towards the light, they themselves could be saved. I ran back to the hole, resolved to try to save as many of them as I could. But before I made it back, I heard a strange rhythmic beeping sound. She has a pulse. Doctor, her vital signs are coming back. I heard someone shouting. The next few days were a blur. The few people I told my story to told me that it's common for people to have vivid hallucinations during near-death experiences. This wasn't a near-death experience. I was clinically dead. I know what I experienced was real. I know that place exists somewhere out there in a world vastly different from our own. I dream of it every night. Remembering those tortured souls, desperately sad at the knowledge that they could free themselves one by one if they would only help each other, instead of dragging each other down in their own panic. To anyone reading this, take my words as a warning. So many of us humans are self-loathing, so much more cruel to ourselves than anyone else. Sometimes we take that cruelty out on others. But you do not deserve to lock yourself away in a cage. You deserve forgiveness. We all do. One day I hope we all find ourselves in that field, where the flowers dance and the wind sings. Please heed my warning. Put down the knife, put down the pills, step off the scale. Stop fighting with your husband. Go look yourself in the mirror and decide today that you don't deserve to be treated the way you've been treating yourself, that you deserve peace. Because if you don't, you will find yourself staring up at the most brilliant light, forever just barely out of your reach.